It was just before 10 a.m. on the 19th of May, 1836, when a shout echoed across Fort Parker. "Indians!" Rachael Parker Plummer had dreaded the day that warning would come. It couldn't have happened at a worse time. Many of the fort's men, including her father and husband, were away working their farm. Just 6 adult men remained to defend the women and children who now faced an incoming force of some 800 Indians advancing across the open plains from the northwest. Fort Parker was little more than a courtyard and a few shacks enclosed by a wooden palisade wall. It kept the wild animals and the stray raider out, but it would never withstand a serious attack. When the Indians sent men forward to negotiate, the residents of Fort Parker had no choice but to meet them. Her uncle Benjamin walked out alone to meet them. Watching from the walls, Plummer could see that these were Commanchee Indians, those roaming warriors of the plains who struck fear into the heart of every soul, from the Rocky Mountains down to the Rio Grande. She knew that her uncle would not be coming back. Her thoughts turned to her 18-month-old son and to the new child growing in her belly, who was barely 3 months along. It was their fate that worried her more than her own. Plummer ran as quickly as she could to find her son. Little James Pratt could not understand what was happening as his mother hastily gathered him up in her arms. As she made for one of the fort's exits, she ran into another of her uncles. "Have they killed him yet?" The last she'd seen of Uncle Benjamin, he'd just been surrounded. "No," she replied. "Not yet," was left unsaid before she ran for the nearest exit. Not yet was not long coming. Just as Plummer exited the fort, she heard the screaming. The Commanchee surged forward and drove their spears into Uncle Benjamin's heart. Plummer could only hold her son tighter and run. The sounds of battle erupted behind her as the remaining men opened fire from the fort, hoping to buy time for the women and children to escape to the nearby tree line to the south and east where the Comanche horsemen couldn't give chase. Plummer prayed, for her son's sake if not for her own. Even as the sound of hooves seemed to get closer, even as the ground began to shake beneath her feet, she prayed. But she wasn't fast enough. A handful of Comanche overtook her and cut off her escape, seeing the desperate mother and her trembling child as nothing more than a prize. They knocked her down and tore the baby from her arms before dragging them both back to the fort. The fighting was already over by the time that she was dragged back. Every man in the fort was dead. She was thrown to the ground near her Uncle Benjamin's corpse as her son was taken away and strapped to a warrior's horse. She cried out for him, but a Comanche woman lashed her with a whip to keep her silent. Plummer could only sob silently as she watched her aunt and cousins be brought over as captives by another band of Comanche. They were brandishing scalps from the fallen men, one of which Plummer recognized by her grandfather's gray hair. The Comanche left Fort Parker empty and in ruins, its men dead and scalped, and the women who hadn't escaped were now bound as prisoners. Rachael Plummer took one last look at the place that she'd called home only an hour before. Then the Comanche whip struck her again, forcing her to face forward and keep walking, and telling her that her ordeal was only just beginning. Plummer and the other survivors marched for days. They were given no food and only a few mouthfuls of water. Every night was agony as their captors bound their hands and feet together and left them face down on the ground, occasionally beating and stepping on them to break their spirit. A scared prisoner was less likely to make trouble after all. They were not even allowed to speak. One time, Plummer made the mistake of trying to speak to her aunt. The Comanche forced them both to the ground and jumped on them until they bled. None of the captives were spared the horror, not even little James, who was kept away from his mother as much as possible. She would often hear him cry for her, but his wailing only made the Comanche beat him to shut him up. Plummer could only watch in heartbroken silence as the captors abused her son for days on end. 5 days after the attack, the Comanche split. Plummer and James were taken by one group, while her aunt and cousins were taken by others. Rachael Plummer would never see them again. However, one of those cousins, Cynthia Ann Parker, would marry a Comanche warrior and give birth to a son, Quanah Parker, who grew to be one of the most famous Comanche leaders in history. Of course, Plummer knew nothing of that. For her, the only thing she could cling to was that her son was still with their group. He wouldn't stop crying, and she was not allowed to comfort him, but at least he was still alive. That was until the 6th day, when her captors suddenly cut her bindings and brought her son to her. All the agony of the previous few days seemed to vanish as she held him again. Neither one had eaten for days, but Plummer tried to suckle him all the same. It was the only thing that she could do for him as his mother. But when the Comanche saw this, they became enraged. They snatched the child away and beat her again. The last time that she ever saw her son, he was crying out for her as a Comanche warrior carried him away. She never knew what they did to him after that, and it was probably better that she didn't know. She never understood why they returned him to her so briefly. Had it been a game to them? Another cruel method of torture? Or had they already decided to be rid of him, and that was their version of letting her say goodbye? The question haunted her for the rest of her life. In less than a week, Plummer had lost almost everything: her home, her freedom, and now her son. However, she still had her life, and the other life growing inside her. At only 3 months along, her pregnancy wasn't immediately obvious. Maybe when it was, they'd kill her, but that was a problem for another time. For now, the child she carried was the only thing keeping her going, and the only thing that mattered. So Plummer endured. She swallowed her grief, bowed her head, and obeyed her captors. It wasn't as if she could escape anyway. They were many miles from Fort Parker. Even if she knew the way back, she would not survive the trip. The Comanche would catch her and kill her before she could get far anyway. The only chance she had, that her child has, was to survive here. The Comanche were now ready to put Plummer to work. She was given as a servant to a warrior within the clan and lived to serve his family. The man she served is mostly absent from her account. Comanche men focused on hunting and raiding and left other work like cooking, foraging, and handicrafts to the women. So it was the man's wife and daughter who ruled her life. The elder mistress and the younger mistress, as she called them, controlled everything. She woke when they told her to, ate when they allowed her, and filled her days with whatever task they needed done. Some days she'd forage for food. Other times she'd cook or clean in the camp, or perhaps she'd have to repair tools or clothes for them. It was the mistress who would beat her and starve her and abuse her if she displeased them. To them, she was little more than a useful pet who needed to be kept in line. As summer melted into fall, the Comanche moved northwest, through mountains and over plains whose beauty still struck Plummer despite her miserable situation. She endured sweltering heat in the lowlands and then freezing cold as the group entered the mountains. Plummer also suffered sexual abuse, but neither her account nor YouTube's guidelines would allow me to go into any detail. They regularly beat her and berated her, but after a while, each day brought a little less than before. She picked up their language and improved at the various tasks that they gave her, and soon she figured out that staying quiet and doing what they asked was the easiest way to live. Of course, it was all in service of a greater goal. To her surprise, the Comanche were not angry when they discovered her pregnancy a few months later. As long as Plummer did her jobs, they didn't seem to care. In October 1836, despite everything she'd endured, Plummer gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Whether she gave birth alone or had some help from the Comanche, we do not know. Either way, the birth of a second son seemed to make all the suffering worthwhile. She could almost forget that her life, and now his, still belonged to the Comanche. At first, the Comanche didn't care about her newborn any more than they cared about her pregnancy. As long as she looked after the child herself and did her jobs, the Comanche said nothing. But how could she be an attentive mother to a newborn while working as a full-time slave? The truth was that she couldn't. No one could. And like any mother faced with such a choice, her child took priority. To her credit, Plummer managed 6 weeks of balancing those two impossible demands. Inevitably, though, her work slipped. The child slowed her down, they said. Eventually, her Commanchee masters decided that her child was too much of a distraction. Early one morning, as she was feeding him, 5 warriors burst into the tent. She already knew what they were there for. One of the warriors grabbed the baby as the others held Plummer down. She kicked and screamed against them, but it was futile. The mother was forced to watch as one of the Comanche warriors lifted her son by the throat and squeezed. It was over in moments. When he stopped moving, they threw him onto the cold ground and left him for her to bury. But then, the child moved. The faintest glimmer of life was still there. In an instant, her grief was replaced with hope. Plummer took him into her arms and cleaned the blood from his fresh wounds as his little chest struggled to draw breath. And for a few precious moments, she believed that life had finally cut her a break. It was a cruel dangling of hope. When the Commanchee learned that the child was alive, they came back. Once again, they tore the child from its mother's arms, but this time they made sure they finished the job. We can't go into detail about what happened next, but this time they were thorough. When they were done making sure that the child was gone, one of the Commanchee tied it behind his horse and circled the camp, whooping and hollering as he went, making doubly sure that the child was dead. The only emotion that Plummer could feel afterwards was gratitude. Gratitude that the Indians were at least kind enough to allow her to bury what remained of her 6-week-old son. Gratitude that her 2 sons were now together in some other, better place. Gratitude that both of them were free from this nightmare that she still had to endure. Plummer's account of her life becomes vague for a long time after this. She offers few details of life with the Commanchee or her own emotional state through late 1836 and most of 1837. Perhaps a mother grieving 2 sons deserves such privacy. The mundane cruelties like beating, exhaustion, and starvation had stopped registering. Those petty miseries were barely noticeable amid the sea of agony the Commanchee had plunged her into. Months rolled into each other as they roamed the plains and prairies. Somehow, Plummer survived, even when she had no idea what she was still living for. Oddly, it was a cave that finally brought her out of her stupor. Late in 1837, somewhere in the Rocky Mountains, Plummer spotted a cave opening not far from where the Commanchee had made camp. She had been with them for close to a year and a half by this point. They knew that she couldn't run away, and she'd built some level of trust, but certainly not affection, with the younger of her 2 mistresses. After a few days, Plummer dared to ask her younger mistress if she could go explore the cave. The younger mistress agreed, but only if she went with her. It was only a short walk away, and they would be back before anyone noticed they were gone. They slipped away from the camp with only a single candle for light and began their descent into the darkness. They didn't get far before they reached a large chamber with a ceiling of crystallized stone that reflected the candlelight like a sky of dazzling stars. Plummer was captivated. It was the first time that she'd felt anything like happiness since losing her second child. But the mistress's daughter grew scared and ordered Plummer to turn back. When Plummer didn't listen, she picked up a piece of wood that she'd brought and began to hit her. The wonder of seeing the cave lit a fire in Plummer's heart. This cave had offered her the first stirrings of happiness in so long, and she refused to let the Commanchee rob her of this too. So Plummer fought back. As the girl swung again, Plummer caught the wood, threw it aside, and leapt at her. The fight was brief and hopelessly one-sided. I cared not for her cries, but firmly told her that if she attempted to force me to return until I was ready, I would kill her. The girl had no choice but to agree. The younger mistress would wait for her at the entrance for as long as Plummer wanted her to. Plummer wrote that the cave descended for miles. Even though she only had 1 candle to light her path, she was never afraid. The cave was a beautiful world all of her own, free from the horrors of life on the surface. She walked for hours through tight passages and giant caverns, along underground rivers and beneath dripping stalactites. At last, she reached a massive cavern with a river of clean water running through it that disappeared down an underground waterfall so deep that she could never see the bottom. It was a dead end, but a beautiful one. In her account, Plummer claimed that she saw a vision of an angel in that cave who came to nurse her wounds and inspired her to keep living. Plummer emerged from that cave a different woman. The taste of freedom, and perhaps more importantly, of defying her captor to experience it, stayed with her. Life continued on for Rachael Plummer. The younger mistress never spoke about their fight in the cave, and Plummer never shared their story either. In March of 1837, the Commanchee met other Indian groups at the headwaters of the Arkansas River. Plummer had learned enough of their tongue to understand that this was a war council, and the Indians had assembled to plan attacks on Texas. The Indians swore that they would wipe out the white man from the land. Their fields would be turned over to Indians, while the plains and prairies would once again be theirs to roam. As the whites had driven them west, so they would now drive the whites east. One of the Indians from another group noticed Plummer following the meeting and spoke the first words of English that she'd heard in over a year. Unfortunately, those words were a curse and a promise that they would turn all of the whites into slaves like her. The combined experiences of the cave and the war meeting changed her. She was braver now, but she also knew that her life would never improve among the Commanchee. She was a tool to them, and many would rather see her dead. Eventually, Plummer decided she'd rather risk the latter than stay the former. It was around February 1838 when the young mistress asked her to go back to fetch a tool while the two of them were foraging near the camp, that Plummer simply said no. The young mistress screamed at her, but Plummer had beaten her once, and she could do it again. So Plummer lunged at her once more. She knocked the girl down and began to beat her. The fight was no more even the second time around. In the struggle, Plummer found a piece of bone on the ground as a weapon and struck her captor with all her strength. She expected the rest of the Commanchee to rush over any moment. They'd shove a spear in her back and leave her for the birds, but at least she'd go down fighting. Except they didn't. The Commanchee watched but didn't intervene. They yelled and screamed around her, but not out of fear. They were watching, judging. Plummer rained blow after blow on the girl until the ground was soaked with blood and the young mistress could barely sob for mercy. At the sight of a broken woman beneath her, Plummer felt a surge of mercy. She stopped, then let the bone drop to the ground and caught her breath. She looked at the beaten and bloodied girl beside her and then, without a word, lifted her up and carried her to camp. Plummer was amazed at the reaction, or lack of it. No one else in the group lifted a finger to her. Even the young mistress seemed friendlier as Plummer cleaned the wounds she'd made just minutes earlier. Later, one of the tribal chiefs approached her and spoke to her with a tone of respect that she'd never heard from any Commanchee. "You are brave to fight, good to a fallen enemy. You are directed by the Great Spirit. She began the fight, and you had a right to kill her. Your noble spirit forbid you." Of course, the girl's mother was not as forgiving. When Plummer returned to their tent, the elder mistress wanted to burn her. The older woman gathered bundles of straw, lit them on fire, and threw them at Plummer. But Plummer knew how the rules worked now. The elder mistress had acted first, so she had every right to react. Plummer leapt at the woman, throwing her burning bundles back at her, and wrestled with her through the camp. It was even easier than beating the younger mistress. Yet again, the Commanchee did not intervene. The fight continued until Plummer was sure that she'd proven her point. Mercy compelled her to stop before doing any serious damage. Then, as she'd done before, she helped her opponent up and cleared her wounds without a word. Plummer was summoned by the tribal chiefs the following day, along with both of her mistresses. She did not hide anything she'd done and told them that she was done being mistreated. The Commanchee had killed her family, killed her children, kidnapped, tortured, and abused her. How could she have acted any differently to them? The chiefs considered her words for a moment and then rendered their judgment. Replace a pole she had broken during one of the fights, and the issue would be forgiven. The Commanchee were a tough people. They valued courage and strength. Plummer had shown both in standing up to her mistresses. In her moment of rebellion, she had earned more respect from her captors than she had earned in 20 months of servitude. Unbeknownst to her, that change in status would not matter for long. A few weeks later, in March 1838, the Comanche spotted newcomers on the horizon, merchants, Comancheros by the look of them, who specialized in trading with Indians. They were the first whites that Plummer had seen since the death of her son. The merchants spotted her easily amongst the Comanche and asked to see her master. The old man rarely bothered with Plummer, but he met the merchants at their request. "Will you sell her to us?" When she heard those words, Plummer's heart leapt, even more when her master said yes. The merchants and the Comanche haggled. Their first offers were too low, and for the moment it seemed that the merchants might give up and leave her there. But then, at last, her Comanche master accepted their price. As suddenly as it had begun, Plummer's captivity with the Comanche was over. Plummer only learned the truth later. Their coming had been no accident. Her father, James Parker, and her husband had been working at a farm nearby when Fort Parker was attacked. By the time they'd returned, the Comanche were long gone with their captives, but they refused to rest until they'd found them again. The two men had spent every waking hour since the massacre trying to find their family. While Plummer was with the Comanche, news of the Fort Parker massacre had spread across North America. Her family used their wealth and connections to spread the word about how the Comanche had taken several family members, including Rachael, and they would do anything to see her returned home. Colonel William Donahoe of Santa Fe was one friend of the family who had heard of their plight. The moment he heard that a band of Comanche had been spotted nearby with a white female captive, Colonel Donahoe ordered a band of Comancheros to rush out to meet them and buy her freedom by any means necessary. On June 20th, 1837, Rachael Plummer left the Comanche in the company of the Comancheros. She was first taken to Santa Fe, where she thanked Colonel Donahoe for what he'd done. After a few weeks of recovery, she was given a horse and fresh supplies to see her through the journey home. At last, as the sun set on February 19, 1838, Rachael Parker Plummer arrived at her father's home in Montgomery County, Texas. Her parents and her husband were there to meet her. She had lost her original home, her uncles, her children, at times her sanity, and even her will to live to the Comanche. But in the end, against all odds, she survived. Tragically, Plummer's story would not get the happily ever after that she'd earned. She became pregnant with her third son within a few weeks of coming home. She gave birth in early March 1839, but died a few days later. Her child did not long outlive her. Although her cause of death was officially listed as complications from childbirth, her family always believed that she had never recovered from her time at the hands of the Comanche. The true blame for her death lay with her captors. Plummer's 21-month ordeal among the Comanche remains one of the most harrowing accounts of life on the 19th century American frontier. Published later in 1838, her Narrative of 21 Months' Servitude was an instant hit. Plummer's account exposed the unimaginable brutality of captivity among the Comanche. Unfortunately, it was also used as proof that all Native Americans were unforgivable savages, with justified violence and abuse by the United States against them in turn. Still, her story is an inspiring tale of survival that doubles as one of the best glimpses into life amongst the Comanche ever written. Her life may have been cut short, but the story of Rachael Parker Plummer has ensured that she will never be forgotten.